Lawrence H. Summers, who served as Treasury Secretary under President Bill Clinton, has become a frequent and pointed critic of Steven Mnuchin, the current Treasury Secretary. Kiyoshi OtaBloomberg, Washington. It is an unwritten rule that if a former Treasury Secretary has nothing nice to say about one of his successors, he does not say anything at all. But in the nation's capital these days, the rules of political comity are meant to be broken. Raising eyebrows in economic circles, Lawrence H. Summers, the mercurial Treasury Secretary for President Bill Clinton, has leveled a barrage of increasingly personal criticism at the current Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin. In podcasts, blog posts, op-eds and on Twitter, Mr. Summers, the former president of Harvard and a top economic advisor to President Barack Obama, has accused Mr. Mnuchin of damaging the credibility of Treasury by making irresponsible economic assessments of the administration's tax plan and acting as a sycophant to President Trump. The attacks have alternately amused and angered those who run in economic circles, with some saying it is Mr. Summers who is damaging the credibility of the office by leveling public attacks on a sitting Treasury Secretary. For me, we have a tradition for people who have been in the position not to criticize current secretaries, said Paul H. O'Neill, who served as President George W. Bush's first Treasury Secretary. That doesn't mean we don't have an opinion, but we don't tell people what we think. But, he added, Larry is his own guy. While Treasury Secretaries have all had varying degrees of success and influence, those who have held the job generally agree that heckles from predecessors are not helpful. From what I can remember, no one really talked badly about others. Franklin Knoll, president of the Treasury Historical Association, said of former Treasury Secretaries, "It doesn't pop into my head because it didn't happen." Some have been taken aback by the personal nature of Mr. Summers' criticism of Mr. Mnuchin. "I think criticism is best when it's specific. If there's a particular statement or policy that you disagree with, say why," said Glenn Hubbard, the dean of Columbia Business School and a former deputy assistant Treasury Secretary. "You don't really need to be ad hominem." Larry Kudlow, an economist who calls himself a friend of Mr. Mnuchin and who advised Mr. Trump's presidential campaign, said that he finds the tenor of the barbs thrown by Mr. Summers to be unwarranted. "It's unseemly for him," said Mr. Kudlow, who considers himself an admirer of Mr. Summers' work. "He's like name-calling, he's making it personal. It's very vitriolic." Secretary of the Treasury Steven Mnuchin looked on as President Trump made remarks during a tax reform industry meeting in the Roosevelt Room of the White House in October. Doug Milster, New York Times. Collegiality is the norm among Treasury Secretaries, who have a tradition of meeting in Washington with new secretaries to welcome them into the fold and offer advice. This year, Mr. Mnuchin was feted at the Metropolitan Club at a dinner arranged by Henry Paulson, who served as Treasury Secretary during Mr. Bush's second term. Mr. Summers attended, along with other former secretaries, including Timothy F. Geithner, Robert Rubin and Mr. O'Neill. Mr. Summers advised Mr. Mnuchin to protect the credibility of the office, according to a person who attended and another person familiar with the conversation. Mr. Summers, who declined to comment for this article, has defended his outspokenness about Mr. Mnuchin as an effort to protect the credibility and trustworthiness of the nation's top economic post. The Treasury Secretary's credibility is an important national asset that could be needed at any moment, Mr. Summers wrote in the Washington Post. "I am very sorry to see it squandered on behalf of a set of tax reform proposals that are at best a bargaining position." On Wednesday, Mr. Summers was back at it, criticizing Mr. Mnuchin in a Politico podcast for suggesting that the tax plan currently being debated by Congress would not add to the federal deficit. "There is a range of estimates that a reasonable and thoughtful person could have, and then there are estimates that if you have them you can really only have them if you were ignorant to the subject or if you were being motivated by politics," Mr. Summers said of Mr. Mnuchin in a Politico podcast that aired on Wednesday. and I'm afraid the claims of Secretary Mnuchin that this would generate so much economic growth that it would pay for itself falls into that category. He added, I'm not aware of so irresponsible an estimate coming from a Treasury Secretary in the last 50 years. For Mr. Summers, that criticism of Mr. Mnuchin was relatively measured compared to his previous salvos. Steven Mnuchin may be the greatest sycophant in cabinet history, Mr. Summers wrote in a September tweet after Mr. Mnuchin defended Mr. Trump's position about professional football players kneeling during the national anthem. In August, Mr. Summers again laced into Mr. Mnuchin over the one-page tax plan unveiled by Treasury in the spring. He said that such a skimpy outline must be demoralizing to the staff at Treasury, and that the Secretary's claims that slashing the corporate and individual income tax rates would not benefit the rich was eroding the credibility of the department. The Treasury Department had no comment about Mr. Summers' treatment of Mr. Mnuchin. For Mr. Mnuchin's part, he has tried to avoid the fray. Asked at a CNBC investor conference this fall about Mr. Summers' suggestion that the Trump administration's tax plan was a ludicrous supply-side fantasy, the secretary demurred, "Well, I would never say anything bad about another Treasury Secretary," Mr. Mnuchin said before adding, "Although there's lots and lots of economists that will line up on the other side of that argument."